Ethan had always dreamed of traveling the world, and today, that dream was finally coming true. With a backpack slung over his shoulder and a camera dangling from his neck, he stepped off the train into a city straight out of a storybook. The air smelled fresh, mixed with the faint aroma of baked goods wafting from nearby cafes. Cobblestone streets stretched in every direction, lined with colorful buildings and charming little shops. But what caught Ethan's attention most was the massive palace at the heart of the city. Its towering spires and golden accents shimmered under the sunlight, drawing crowds of tourists like moths to a flame. Ethan joined the throng of visitors making their way toward the palace gates. He felt a strange mix of excitement and arrogance. Excited to see something so grand, but also convinced that nothing could really impress him. After all, he'd seen pictures online, scrolled past videos, and read countless reviews about how amazing this place was. Surely it couldn't live up to the hype. As he walked, munching on a bag of chips he'd bought from a street vendor, Ethan barely paid attention to the signs posted along the path. They politely reminded visitors to respect the surroundings, keep the area clean, and avoid disturbing the royal guards stationed around the palace. When Ethan finally reached the gates, he stopped to take it all in. The palace was even more impressive. Up close, its intricate details and majestic presence almost otherworldly. Tourists buzzed around, snapping photos and marveling at the sight. But Ethan's eyes quickly shifted to the guards standing silently near the entrance. Clad in striking red coats, shiny black boots, and tall bearskin hats, they looked like statues brought to life. Their faces were expressionless, their posture impossibly perfect. Ethan tilted his head, studying them curiously. How did they stand? There for hours without moving. Didn't they get bored? His curiosity soon turned into amusement. To Ethan, the whole setup seemed ridiculous. Why go through so much effort just to stand around doing nothing? He chuckled softly to himself, thinking about how easy their job must be compared to his own back home. Without realizing it, Ethan started to feel a sense of superiority, as if he were somehow better than these silent figures who didn't react no matter what happened around them. It was then that an idea popped into his head, an idea that would change everything. Finishing the last chip from his bag, Ethan crumpled it up absent-mindedly. For a moment he glanced around, looking for a trash can. But when he didn't spot one right away, he shrugged it off. Who cared? There were already wrappers and bottles scattered here and there anyway. One more piece of trash wouldn't hurt. Besides, wasn't someone getting paid to clean this stuff up? With a smirk playing on his lips, Ethan took aim and nonchalantly tossed the empty chip bag onto the polished boot of the nearest guard. The reaction, or rather, lack thereof, from the guard surprised even Ethan. Not a single muscle moved. No glare, no sigh, no indication that the man had even noticed. Ethan expected some kind of response, maybe a raised eyebrow or a subtle shift in stance. But nothing. The guard remained utterly still, as though carved from stone. This only made Ethan laugh louder, enjoying the absurdity of the situation. He turned to share the moment with the people around him, expecting them to join in his amusement. Instead, he was met with disapproving stares and murmurs of disbelief. For a brief second, Ethan hesitated. Was he missing something? Did everyone else know something he didn't? Shaking off the thought, he decided not to dwell on it. After all, it was just a joke, a harmless bit of fun. What harm could it possibly do? Little did Ethan know those few seconds of carelessness were about to set off a chain of events that would leave a lasting mark on his life. The moment Ethan tossed the crumpled chip bag onto the guard's boot, a strange hush fell over the crowd. People who had been chatting excitedly or snapping photos just moments before suddenly grew quiet, their attention shifting entirely to Ethan and the silent figure in front of him. Some tourists exchanged nervous glances, while others whispered, behind cupped hands. A few even stepped back as if trying to distance themselves from what was unfolding, but Ethan didn't notice any of this, or at least he pretended not to. His focus was on the guard, waiting for some kind of reaction, something to justify his prank, but there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. The guard stood completely still, his face an unreadable mask. Not a twitch, not a blink, not even the slightest shift in weight. It was as though Ethan wasn't even there. At first, Ethan found it hilarious. He nudged the person next to him, a middle-aged woman holding a map, and said with a grin, "Did you see that? They're like robots." But instead of laughing along, the woman gave him a sharp look, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You shouldn't have done that," she muttered under her breath before turning away. Ethan frowned, confused by her reaction. What was the big deal? It was just a joke, right? Sure, maybe it wasn't the classiest thing he'd ever done, but it wasn't exactly criminal either. Or so he thought. As he scanned the faces around him, he realized no one seemed to share his sense of humor. Instead, they looked uncomfortable, disapproving, even angry. One older man shook his head slowly, muttering something in a language Ethan didn't understand. Another tourist, a young mother with 2 kids in tow, grabbed her children's hands and hurried them away, shooting Ethan a glare that made his stomach twist slightly. Still, Ethan refused to let himself feel bad. If anything, he doubled down, convincing himself that everyone else was overreacting. He shrugged off the tension in the air and turned to leave, figuring the whole thing would blow over soon enough. After all, how long could people stay mad about a stupid chip bag? As he walked away, however, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The murmurs followed him, growing louder as he moved farther from the palace gates. Words like disrespectful and unbelievable floated through the chatter, making Ethan's ears burn despite his best efforts to ignore them. Then came the warnings. An elderly man with a cane shuffled up beside him, his weathered face etched with concern. "Young man," he said in heavily accented English, "you don't understand what you've done." Ethan stopped, surprised by the seriousness in the stranger's voice. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to sound casual but failing to hide the edge of defensiveness creeping into his tone. The old man sighed deeply, leaning on his cane, for support. "Those guards, they are more than just symbols. They protect our history, our culture. To disrespect them is to disrespect us all." Ethan blinked, taken aback by the weight of the man's words. For a split second, doubt flickered in his mind. Maybe he had gone too far. But almost immediately his pride kicked in, pushing those thoughts aside. "Come on," he replied with forced laughter. "It's just a little trash. I'm sure they've dealt with worse." The old man's expression darkened, and he shook his head sadly. "You'll see," he said cryptically before hobbling away, leaving Ethan standing alone amidst the murmuring crowd. As the minutes ticked by, Ethan tried to brush off the encounter, telling himself it didn't matter what anyone thought. He was just having fun. What was wrong with that? Yet deep down, a tiny seed of unease began to take root. The way people were looking at him, the disapproval in their eyes, the whispers following him wherever he went, it was starting to get to him. And then there was the guard, whose stoic silence lingered in Ethan's mind like a shadow he couldn't shake. Why hadn't the man reacted? Why hadn't he said or done anything? Little did Ethan know, his recklessness was about to catch up with him in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. While he continued wandering through the city, oblivious to the storm brewing behind the scenes, forces far beyond his understanding were already in motion. Unbeknownst to him, those 15 minutes of carefree behavior were about to transform into a lesson he would never forget. A lesson that would force him to confront the consequences of his actions in the most unexpected way possible. Ethan tried to push the old man's warning out of his mind, but it lingered like an itch he couldn't scratch. As he strolled through the city square, the weight of the disapproving stares followed him. He told himself it didn't matter. What? Did he care what a bunch of strangers thought? Still, the uneasy feeling in his chest wouldn't go away. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, as if the cobblestones beneath his feet were silently judging him too. To distract himself, Ethan wandered into a small park near the palace. It was quieter here, with fewer tourists and more locals enjoying the afternoon sun. Families picnicked on blankets spread across the grass, children chased each other around fountains, and elderly couples sat on benches feeding pigeons. The peaceful scene should have calmed him, but instead, It only made him feel more out of place. He noticed how clean the area was. No trash littering the ground, no wrappers blowing in the breeze. Even the bins were neatly organized, their contents carefully sorted. For the first time, Ethan wondered why he hadn't bothered to find one earlier before tossing his chip bag. As he leaned against a tree, watching a group of kids laugh and play tag, a young woman approached him. She looked to be in her late 20s, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, with a warm smile that quickly turned serious when she spoke. "Excuse me?" she said softly, pointing to the logo on her jacket, a badge indicating she worked for the city's tourism office. "I heard about what happened at the palace gates." Ethan stiffened, his defenses rising instantly. "What are you talking about?" he asked, though he already knew exactly what she meant. The woman hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "The guard you interacted with. Look, I'm not here to scold you or anything, but I think you need to understand something important." She glanced around, lowering her voice. "Those guards aren't just there for show. They're part of a tradition that goes back hundreds of years. Their job is to protect not only the palace, but also the values it represents: respect, discipline, and pride. When you disrespect them, you're disrespecting all of that." Ethan rolled, his eyes annoyed by yet another lecture. "It was just a joke," he muttered, crossing his arms. "I didn't mean anything by it." The woman sighed, clearly frustrated but patient. "That's the thing. You don't realize how much meaning people attach to those guards. To us, they're not just standing there looking fancy. They symbolize everything this country stands for, and trust me, messing with them doesn't end well." Her tone sent a chill down Ethan's spine. "What do you mean, doesn't end well?" he asked, unable to keep the nervousness out of his voice. She hesitated again, glancing over her shoulder as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Let's just say there are rules, strict ones, and breaking them can lead to consequences. I'd suggest you keep an eye out for the next little while. You might want to apologize while you still can." Before Ethan could respond, she gave him a tight-lipped smile and walked away, leaving him standing there with a sinking feeling in his stomach. What kind of consequences was she talking about? Was she exaggerating to scare him, or was there really something worse waiting for him? His mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. He decided to test her warning by asking a nearby vendor selling souvenirs. Leaning casually against the cart, he struck up a conversation. "Hey, do you know anything about those palace guards?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Like, what happens if someone messes with them?" The vendor raised an eyebrow, studying Ethan closely. "Why do you ask?" Ethan shrugged, forcing a laugh. "Just curious. Someone mentioned something weird earlier, and I wanted to know if it's true." The vendor's expression darkened. "Depends on what you did," he said, slowly. "If it's something serious, they don't let it slide. Ever. Those guards may look quiet, but they answer to higher-ups who take things very seriously. Trust me, you don't want to find out what happens when they decide to act." Ethan swallowed hard, suddenly regretting every dismissive thought he'd had since arriving in the city. The warnings from the old man, the tourism worker, and now the vendor, they all pointed to the same conclusion. He'd made a mistake, and it wasn't going to go unnoticed. But how bad could it really be? Surely they weren't going to arrest him or throw him in jail over a crumpled chip bag, right? As Ethan stood there lost in his thoughts, he failed to notice 3 figures approaching from the distance. Their polished boots clicked rhythmically against the pavement, drawing closer with each passing second. By the time he finally looked up, it was too late. The guards had arrived, and their presence was impossible to ignore. One of them stepped forward, holding out a folded piece of paper bearing an official seal. Ethan's heart sank as he realized his carefree attitude had landed him in deeper trouble than he could have imagined. Ethan's stomach dropped the moment he saw the guards approaching. Their boots clicked sharply against the cobblestones, each step echoing like a countdown to something inevitable. The trio moved with precision, their expressions unreadable but undeniably serious. Ethan froze, unsure whether to stay put or make a run for it. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but his feet felt rooted to the spot, as if some invisible force was holding him in place. The lead guard stopped just a few paces away, his towering figure casting a shadow over Ethan. Without saying a word, he extended a gloved hand, offering a folded piece of paper. Ethan hesitated, staring at it as though it might bite. Finally, curiosity, or perhaps fear, got the better of him, and he reached out shakily to take it. The paper was crisp, embossed with an ornate gold seal that gleamed under the sunlight. It looked official. Too official. "What's this?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling slightly despite his attempt to sound confident. The guard didn't answer. Instead, he simply pointed toward the palace in the distance, his gesture firm and unmistakable. Ethan's heart began to race. Whatever this summons was, it wasn't optional. He glanced around nervously, hoping someone would step in and explain what was happening. But the handful of tourists nearby had already backed away, clearly wanting no part of whatever trouble Ethan had stirred up. Even the vendor who'd warned him earlier had vanished, leaving nothing but an empty cart behind. With no other choice, Ethan reluctantly followed the guards, clutching the mysterious document tightly in his hand. As they walked, the weight of the situation pressed down on him harder than ever. Questions swirled in his mind. What did the paper say? Who had sent it? And why were these guards treating him like some kind of criminal? His attempts to ask them directly went unanswered. They marched ahead silently, their faces as impassive as stone walls. When they finally reached the palace gates, Ethan was struck once again by its sheer grandeur. Up close, the intricate carvings and towering pillars seemed even more imposing, almost intimidating. The guards led him through a side entrance, bypassing the main hall where tourists usually gathered. Inside, the air was cool and still, filled with the faint scent of polished wood and fresh flowers. The opulence of the interior took Ethan's breath away. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings, gilded mirrors lined the walls, and rich tapestries depicted scenes of battles and coronations long past. But there was no time to admire the beauty. The guards ushered him briskly down a series of corridors until they arrived at a set of heavy wooden doors. One of the guards knocked firmly, and after a brief pause, the doors creaked open. Inside was a spacious chamber adorned with flags bearing the royal crest. At the far end of the room stood a desk, behind which sat a stern-looking officer dressed in a pristine uniform adorned with medals and insignias. His piercing gaze locked onto Ethan the moment he entered, making him feel like a bug under a microscope. "Sit," the officer commanded curtly, gesturing to a chair positioned in front of the desk. Ethan obeyed, sinking into the seat as though it might swallow him whole. The guards remained standing by the door, their presence looming like silent sentinels. For several long moments, the officer said nothing, allowing the tension in the room to build. Ethan squirmed uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact and wishing he could disappear. Finally, the officer spoke. His voice was calm, but carried an authority that left no room for argument. "You are aware, I assume, of the significance of our royal guards," he began, his tone measured yet sharp. When Ethan nodded weakly, the officer continued. "Their role is not merely ceremonial. They represent centuries of tradition, discipline, and honor. To disrespect them is to insult the very foundation upon which this nation stands." Ethan opened his mouth to defend himself, but the officer raised a hand, silencing him before he could utter a word. "Your actions today have been reported. Littering is unacceptable anywhere, but doing so deliberately on one of my men crosses a line. This behavior cannot and will not go unpunished." Panic bubbled inside Ethan. Punishment? Was he going to be fined, arrested, sent home in disgrace? Before he could spiral further into dread, the officer slid a sheet of paper across the desk. On it was written a simple directive. Ethan was to spend the next 3 hours cleaning the palace grounds under the supervision of the maintenance staff. No excuse. The moment Ethan stepped outside with a trash bag in one hand and a pair of gloves in the other, he felt the weight of his punishment fully sink in. The palace grounds were immaculate, every blade of grass trimmed to perfection, every pathway swept clean. It was hard to believe anyone would even think about littering here. Yet there he was, tasked with picking up garbage that wasn't his own, but had become symbolic of his earlier disrespect. A member of the maintenance staff named Maria greeted him with a polite nod. She was middle-aged, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Follow me," she said simply, leading him toward a section of the garden where a few scattered wrappers lay on the ground. Ethan hesitated, glancing around nervously. Tourists milled about nearby, some snapping photos, others chatting animatedly as they admired the scenery. None of them seemed to notice him yet, but he couldn't shake the fear that someone might recognize him, the guy who'd tossed trash on a guard's boot just hours earlier. Maria handed him a pair of tongs and gestured for him to get started. "We'll work together," she said, her tone neutral but firm. Ethan nodded reluctantly and bent down to pick up the first piece of trash, a candy wrapper half hidden beneath a bush. As he dropped it into the bag, he caught sight of Maria watching him closely. Her expression gave nothing away, but her silence felt heavier than any lecture he'd received so far. As the minutes ticked by, Ethan began to notice things he hadn't before. He saw how meticulously the gardeners cared for the plants, pruning leaves and watering flowers with quiet dedication. He observed families spreading picnic blankets on the grass, laughing and sharing meals while surrounded by beauty. He noticed children running barefoot across the lawn, their faces glowing with joy as they chased butterflies or played hide-and-seek among the trees. Every corner of the palace grounds exuded effort to preserve its elegance, effort to create a space where people could feel wonder and peace. And then it hit him. This place wasn't just scenic, it was sacred. To many locals, it represented history, pride, and unity. For tourists, it offered a glimpse into something extraordinary. But for Ethan, it had been nothing more than a backdrop for his carelessness. Each crumpled soda can and discarded snack wrapper he picked up reminded him of his own contribution to ruining that perfection. What made it worse was knowing that the mess hadn't been accidental. It had been deliberate. By the time they moved closer to the fountain near the palace gates, Ethan's hands were sore, and his back ached from bending over repeatedly. Still, he kept going, driven by a growing sense of shame. A group of tourists approached the fountain, taking turns posing for pictures. One little girl accidentally dropped an ice cream cone, staining the pristine stone base. Her mother immediately apologized and pulled out a tissue to clean it up, scolding the child gently. Watching this exchange, Ethan realized how much effort went into maintaining such order, and how easily it could be undone by thoughtless actions like his own. Maria finally broke the silence between them. "You know," she said softly, "most people don't realize how much work goes into keeping places like this beautiful. We start early in the morning and finish late at night. Every day we make sure everything is perfect because it matters. Not just to us, but to everyone who comes here." Ethan looked at her, surprised by her openness. "I'm sorry," he blurted out, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I didn't mean to cause trouble. I was stupid." Maria studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Everyone makes mistakes," she said. "What matters is learning from them." Her words struck a chord deep within him. For the first time since arriving in the city, Ethan truly understood what it meant to take responsibility for his actions. Picking up trash wasn't just about cleaning up a mess. It was about understanding the impact of his choices and respecting the efforts of those around him. When the 3 hours finally came to an end, Ethan stood up straight, stretching his stiff muscles. His trash bag was full and his gloves were covered in dirt and grime, but he felt lighter somehow, as though shedding a burden he hadn't known he was carrying. Maria patted him on the shoulder approvingly. "Good job," she said. "Now, you've earned your second chance." Ethan nodded, grateful for her kindness and wisdom. Though the experience had been humbling, it had also been eye-opening. As he walked away from the gardens, he resolved never to take such beauty, or the people who worked tirelessly to maintain it, for granted again. Little did he know, his journey toward redemption was only beginning. As Ethan walked away from the palace gardens, his legs ached and his hands were still sticky from handling trash. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the storm of emotions swirling inside him. For hours he had knelt on the ground, picking up wrappers, bottles and scraps of paper, each piece a reminder of how carelessly he had treated this sacred place. He felt smaller now, humbled in ways he hadn't expected. The grandeur of the palace no longer seemed like something to laugh at. Instead, it stood as a testament to dedication, respect, and hard work. Ethan knew he wasn't finished yet. Before leaving, he wanted to do one last thing: apologize to the guard whose boot he had dirtied earlier. It wasn't just about clearing his conscience. It was about acknowledging the gravity of what he'd done. With hesitant steps, he made his way back toward the palace gates where the same guards stood silently in their posts. Their stoic presence seemed even more imposing now that Ethan understood the significance of their role. When he reached the gate, Ethan stopped a few feet away from the guard who had been the target of his prank. The man looked exactly as he had before, perfectly still, his face expressionless, his posture unwavering. Taking a deep breath, Ethan approached cautiously, half expecting the guard to ignore him again. But this time, he wasn't going to walk away without saying what needed to be said. "I'm sorry," Ethan began, his voice trembling slightly. I know what I did was wrong. Really wrong. I didn't understand then, but I see it now. You represent something important, not just to this palace, but to everyone here. And I disrespected that. I'm truly sorry." For a moment, there was silence. The guard didn't move, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge Ethan's words in any visible way. Ethan's heart sank, wondering if his apology had fallen on deaf ears. Just as he was about to turn and leave, the guard finally shifted ever so slightly. His lips parted, and he spoke in a low, measured tone. "Respect is earned, not given freely." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the chest. They were simple, yet they carried immense weight. Respect wasn't something you could demand or expect. It had to be shown, proven through actions rather than empty promises. The guard's response wasn't harsh or angry, but it left no room for misunderstanding. If Ethan wanted forgiveness, or redemption, he would have to earn it. Feeling both ashamed and oddly inspired, Ethan nodded earnestly. "Thank you," he said softly, meeting the guard's steady gaze. "I'll remember that." As Ethan stepped back, he noticed subtle changes in the atmosphere around him. A few tourists glanced his way, some with curiosity, others with approval. One elderly woman smiled faintly, nodding her head as if to say, "Good job." Even the other guards seemed to relax slightly, their rigid stances easing just a fraction. It was as though Ethan's sincere apology had shifted something intangible in the air, a small ripple of reconciliation. Walking away from the palace, Ethan couldn't help but replay the guard's words in his mind. "Respect is earned, not given freely." They echoed in his thoughts, weaving themselves into the fabric of his being. He realized that his journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. Apologizing was a start, but true change required consistent effort. How he acted moving forward would define whether he truly learned from this experience or let it fade into another forgotten memory. By the time Ethan reached his hostel later that evening, exhaustion weighed heavily on him. Yet, despite the long day, he felt strangely lighter, as though a burden he hadn't fully recognized until now had begun to lift. Sitting on the edge of his bunk bed, he pulled out a notebook and scribbled down everything that had happened: the warnings, the punishment, the lessons, and finally the apology. Writing it all out helped solidify the day's events in his mind, turning them from fleeting moments into lasting reflections. That night, as Ethan drifted off to sleep, he vowed to carry these lessons with him wherever life took him next. He didn't want to be the person who tossed trash carelessly or mocked traditions he didn't understand. Instead, he wanted to be someone who respected the world around him, someone who appreciated the efforts of others, and most importantly, someone who earned the trust and admiration of those he encountered. Little did he know this single day would shape the course of his future in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Years had passed since Ethan's fateful trip to the city with the Grand Palace, but the memory of that day remained vivid in his mind. It wasn't just a story he told occasionally. It was a lesson etched into his very being, shaping how he approached life and interacted with the world around him. The once carefree tourist who thoughtlessly tossed trash on a royal guard's boot was gone, replaced by a man who carried himself with a newfound sense of purpose. Ethan returned to the city several years later, this time not as a visitor but as an advocate for environmental responsibility. His journey had been unexpected, sparked by the events of that humbling day. After returning home from his travels, he found himself unable to forget the lessons he'd learned. The importance of respect, discipline, and taking care of shared spaces. He began volunteering at local cleanup drives, organizing community efforts to reduce litter, and speaking at schools about the impact of small actions on larger environments. What started as a personal mission soon grew into something bigger, a career dedicated to protecting public spaces and fostering a culture of mindfulness. Standing outside the palace gates once again, Ethan felt a mix of emotions, nervousness, gratitude, and a quiet determination. This time he wasn't there to marvel at its beauty or snap photos for social media. He was there to thank the people who had unknowingly changed his life. With a deep breath, he approached one of the guards stationed near the entrance. Though it wasn't the same guard from all those years ago, the uniform and posture evoked the same sense of reverence. "Excuse me," Ethan said politely, offering a respectful nod. "I don't know if you remember me, but I wanted to express my gratitude. A few years back I made a mistake here, a big one, and your colleague taught me a lesson I'll never forget." The guard studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. "We are glad to hear it," he replied simply, his voice calm and measured. "Our duty is to protect and inspire respect. It seems we succeeded in your case." Ethan smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "You did more than succeed," he admitted. "That day changed everything for me. I went from being someone who didn't think twice about throwing trash on the ground to someone who now spends every day trying to make sure others don't have to deal with the messes we leave behind." The guard's eyes softened ever so slightly, though his stance remained rigid. "It is good to see someone take responsibility," he said. Many would have walked away unchanged. After thanking the guard, Ethan wandered through the palace grounds, taking in their pristine beauty with fresh eyes. Families strolled along the pathways, children laughed near the fountain, and tourists admired the intricate architecture. Everywhere he looked, he saw signs of care that extended beyond the physical upkeep of the space. It was evident in the way people treated each other, the way they paused to appreciate the surroundings, and the way they left no trace of their presence except smiles and memories. Ethan eventually found himself standing before the fountain where he had cleaned up spilled ice cream during his punishment. Sitting on a nearby bench, he reflected on how far he'd come since then. The shame and embarrassment he'd felt that day weren't burdens anymore. They were reminders of growth. He realized that while mistakes could define us, they didn't have to break us. Instead, they could push us toward becoming better versions of ourselves. As the sun began to set, casting golden hues over the palace walls, Ethan decided to share his story publicly. He reached out to local news outlets and tourism boards, offering to speak at events or write articles about his experience. His message was simple yet powerful. Respect isn't just a word, it's an action, and every action matters. Through interviews and speeches, he recounted the events of that transformative day, emphasizing the importance of treating places, traditions, and people with dignity. To his surprise, his story resonated deeply with audiences. People wrote to him, sharing their own moments of realization and change. Some confessed to similar acts of carelessness in the past, vowing to do better. Others thanked him for reminding them of the value of respect, not just for landmarks, like the palace, but for the everyday spaces they inhabited. By the time Ethan boarded the train to leave the city, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The boy who had once mocked a royal guard was now a man working tirelessly to honor the values they represented. As the train pulled away, Ethan glanced out the window at the towering spires of the palace one last time. He knew he'd carry its lessons with him forever, passing them on to anyone willing to listen. Little did he know, his story would continue to inspire others long after he was gone. Ethan's journey didn't end with his return to the palace or the interviews he gave while in the city. In fact, it was only the beginning of a ripple effect that spread far beyond what he could have imagined. His story, simple as it was, resonated deeply because it wasn't just about him. It was about something universal, the power of learning from mistakes and transforming regret into action. People connected with his honesty, his vulnerability, and the tangible steps he had taken to make amends. Back home, Ethan threw himself into his advocacy work with renewed passion. He started a nonprofit organization called Respect Your Space, aimed at educating communities about environmental stewardship and cultural sensitivity. The initiative focused on two core principles: taking care of public spaces and honoring the traditions and values of places we visit. Schools invited him to speak to students, businesses sought his advice on sustainability practices, and local governments partnered with him to launch awareness campaigns. What began as a personal mission became a movement, one that touched lives across cities, countries, and even continents. One of the most rewarding aspects of Ethan's new role was hearing from people who had been inspired by his story. A young woman named Clara reached out to him after reading an article about his experience. She confessed that she used to litter without thinking twice, but decided to change her habits after learning about Ethan's transformation. "I realized I wasn't just throwing trash on the ground. I was disrespecting the people who worked hard to keep our world beautiful," she wrote. "Thank you for showing me that small actions can lead to big changes." Another message came from a father named Mark, who shared how Ethan's story had impacted his family. After reading one of Ethan's interviews, Mark took his kids on a weekend trip to clean up a nearby park. "We made it a game. Whoever picked up the most trash got to choose dinner that night," he explained. "It turned into something fun, and now my kids remind me to throw things away properly. You've created a little army of helpers." These messages poured in regularly, each one fueling Ethan's determination to keep going. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when he received an invitation to speak at a global conference on sustainable tourism. Standing on stage in in front of hundreds of attendees, environmentalists, policymakers, travel industry leaders, and everyday citizens, Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. Looking out at the sea of faces, he remembered the nervous, embarrassed young man he'd once been and marveled at how far he'd come. "I'm not here to tell you I'm perfect," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "In fact, I'm proof that none of us are. We all make mistakes, say things we regret, do things we wish we could undo. But the difference lies in whether we let those moments define us or refine us." He went on to recount the events of that pivotal day: the chip bag tossed onto the guard's boot, the warnings he ignored, the punishment that humbled him, and the apology that changed his perspective. "That guard taught me something I'll never forget," Ethan said, pausing to let the words sink in. "Respect isn't given freely. It's earned through action. And once you earn it, you have a responsibility to carry it forward." The audience erupted into applause, but Ethan knew the real reward lay in the connections he forged afterward. Attendees lined up to speak with him, sharing their own stories and pledging to adopt more mindful habits. One elderly woman approached him with tears in her eyes, thanking him for reminding her of the importance of preserving cultural heritage. "Your story brought back memories of my childhood," she said softly. "We used to take off our shoes before entering temples, not because someone told us to, but because it felt right. Thank you for bringing that feeling back." As years passed, Ethan continued to grow both personally and professionally. He traveled extensively, visiting landmarks and meeting locals who were passionate about protecting their environments. Along the way, he documented his experiences in a book titled From Trash to Treasure: Lessons in Respect and Redemption. It became a bestseller, translated into multiple languages and read by audiences worldwide. Readers praised its relatable tone and practical advice, calling it a guidebook for living responsibly. But for Ethan, success wasn't measured in accolades or sales figures, it was measured in impact. Every time someone sent him a photo of a cleaned-up beach, every time a child wrote to say they'd stopped littering, and every time a community implemented a program inspired by his work, Ethan felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He'd go,